Hey folks, Granite Wheeler here. Today I'm going to show you how I wired in the E-lockers that came with my Dana 60 axles to the factory wiring of my 2013 Jeep Wrangler Rubicon. I'm also going to show you how I wired in some bypass switches so that I can turn on the lockers anytime I want in two-wheel drive or four-wheel drive. Alright, let's get started by looking at this wiring diagram. I created this diagram from scratch after looking at the factory wiring diagram and after working with my own Jeep, which is a 2013 Jeep Wrangler Rubicon. On the left side of the schematic, we have the TIPM, which is an acronym for Totally Integrated Power Module. The TIPM distributes power and controls everything. It's located under the hood at the passenger side fender. In the center of the schematic, we have the locker relays. On the Jeep, the locker relays are located at the top of the passenger side fender close to the firewall. And at the right side of the schematic, the front and rear axle assemblies are depicted. Each axle has a magnetic locker and mechanically actuated switch inside. Electronically speaking, you could look at these front and rear axles as just giant, heavy-duty relays that tell the TIPM when the lockers are engaged and to turn on the dash lights. Let's take note of a few things in this schematic. Power to both relays and both lockers is provided through the 20 amp fuse located in the TIPM in slot M03. The wire color is yellow with a red stripe, and power is supplied all the time, even when the key is not in the ignition. The TIPM turns on the locker relays when the button in the dash is pressed and after the preconditions are met by providing a ground to complete the circuit. The TIPM can be overridden, forcing the lockers to come on manually if the front and rear control wires are connected directly to a ground source. I'll speak more about this later. My two aftermarket lockers are from different manufacturers, and each of them came with a 10 amp fuse. I've had zero issues running two aftermarket lockers on the single 20 amp factory fuse. The ground for the lockers is at location G905A, which is at the passenger side fender next to the TIPM. Not included in the schematic are the factory Rubicon switches. I left the factory switches in place and they are still fully functional. These switches are just momentary switches that signal the TIPM that you want to turn the lockers on or turn the lockers off. All of the relays referenced in this video have 5 pins and can be wired as normally open or normally closed. Even the factory lockers have 5 pins if you unplug them and have a look. All of the relays are wired for normally open and are only active when the lockers are engaged. The red X's show the unused pins. For simplicity, let's focus on just the rear wiring for a stock Rubicon Dana 44. Other than a few different wire colors, the front wiring is the same. When the TIPM supplies a ground to the rear relay through the violet with light green wire, it completes the circuit, energizing the relay. The relay then instantly energizes the electromagnet in the rear locker, and as long as everything is working correctly, the locker engages. This also actuates the rear sense switch to complete the circuit and signal the TIPM that the locker is engaged. Okay, so when we upgrade the stock Rubicon Dana 44 axle to a Dana 60 or something even better, it will not have the mechanism or built-in switch that confirms when the locker is engaged. This creates two issues when using the factory Rubicon dash switches to engage the lockers. First, the dash light will blink rather than stay on solid. This in and of itself is no big deal. The other more important issue is that the TIPM will not be aware when the locker is actually enabled. What happens is that, after a timeout of not sensing that the locker is engaged, the TIPM will turn off the locker relay. We need to replace the OEM lock sensing switch with something else that will fool the TIPM. And the way we are going to solve that problem is by wiring in a normally open relay to the factory wiring harness in place of the OEM switch. The switch portion of the relay is wired to the locker sense circuit. The electromagnet portion of the relay is wired in parallel to the rear locker. Now, When the locker is enabled using the factory Rubicon switch, both of these relays are triggered at the same time. This will energize the electromagnet and the locker as well as the tiny electromagnet inside the relay, signaling the TIPM that the locker is engaged. This will make the dash light stay on solid and ensure that power to the locker is not cut. I've been running with this configuration using only the factory Rubicon switch for about 5 years without issue. The only complaint is that you are limited as to when you can actually enable the lockers. As I mentioned earlier, the control wire can be connected directly to ground. This will override the TIPM and enable the locker as soon as the connection to ground is made, whether the Jeep is in 2-wheel drive, 4-wheel drive high, or 4-wheel drive low. In this example, when the violet wire with light green stripe is shorted directly to ground, the lockers will come on. As you can see, there is a third relay wired into the circuit. Remember what I said earlier, that the power source for the locker relay and the locker itself are always powered, even when the key is off. This poses a problem when using a locker override. The locker override will function even when the key is completely removed from the Jeep. This leaves open the possibility of accidentally leaving the lockers enabled when unintended and coming back to a Jeep with a dead battery. I came up with a couple of different approaches to solving this challenge and ultimately decided on adding another relay to each locker circuit. Power is supplied to the relays by a fuse that I added in. Using a test light, I found the fuse location M14 to be vacant and functional. It provides switched power, so it only operates when the key is in the run position. The circuit is completed when the override switch is pressed, providing a ground to trigger the relay. Starting at the lower left of this diagram and then stepping up and to the right, pressing the override switch energizes the override relay, which instantly energizes the factory locker relay. The locker relay in turn instantly energizes the locker and the locker sense relay, telling the TIPM that the locker is engaged. Now that we've seen enough of the wiring diagrams, let's go out and take a look at everything on the Jeep. For the locker sense relays, I picked up a box of 5 waterproof relays on Amazon. These relays will be under the Jeep and exposed to the elements. They appear to be well made and have been holding up well. They look similar to the stock Rubicon locker relays, which also appear to be waterproof. When wiring in the relays, I left the factory wiring as long as possible and just connected the factory locker sense wiring to the relay harness. I installed the sense relay directly above the rear differential. Mounting the rear relay was easy. There was an unused hole on the evap canister relocation kit, and I just used that. For the front, I found an unused threaded bolt hole in the frame rail just next to the driver's side engine mount and directly below the steering box. For the override relays, I decided to use smaller relays since they will be mounted under the hood where space is already limited. The connectors included with these relays slide together side to side or end to end, allowing them to be clustered, which makes for a little cleaner install. I secured mine to the wire harness on the firewall behind the battery and close to the factory Rubicon locker relays. To provide power for the relays, I used an add-a-circuit fuse tab and plugged it into a spare fuse slot in the TIPM. The fuse slot I used was M14. For tapping into the wiring harness near the relays, I used these posi taps. I've been using them for years and they've worked well. What I like about them is that they seal well and that they can be reused. Each connector consists of 3 pieces. They screw together easily. After thinking about it for a long time, I decided to mount my override switches to the shift lever. After looking at a lot of switches, I finally found these motorcycle handlebar switches on Amazon. The switch assembly contains 2 single-pole, single-throw switches. These switches are available as momentary or selective. I chose selective so that they stay on when they're pressed. In my case, the switches were wired with 2 blue wires and 2 black wires. 2 blue wires went to one switch, 2 black wires went to another switch. When you take apart the switch, you'll see which color goes to which switch. You should also test for continuity with the continuity checker when the switch is pressed. This is how I mounted the switch assembly. I ran the switch wiring down along the shift lever and then along through to the firewall. I left a small stress relief loop near the base of the shift lever and double-checked everything for interference. I had the glove box out when I ran the wiring. And this is after final assembly. The shift lever's outer diameter is smaller than the inner diameter of the switch assembly. To give it a tight fit that wouldn't move, I used one layer of heater hose and then a layer of thin bicycle inner tube between the heater hose and the shift lever. Before wiring everything in, I just clamped on the switch and daily drove the Jeep for almost 2 months. For me, the switches are in the perfect spot. There's the front switch, the rear switch, and then there's the taint. Taint the front locker and taint the rear locker. Anyway, the ergonomics are great and there are no clearance issues in any of the gears. I'm already contemplating the idea of adding another set of switches below this one to operate the winch relays. The indicator lights in the dash for the lockers work a little differently after the modifications. When using the stock Rubicon locker switch in the dash and the Jeep is in four-wheel drive low, the locker lights will operate normally. They will be on solid. When using the override switches as I'm doing here, the locker lights will flash to indicate that your lockers are on. This will even be the case if you are in four-wheel drive low. Well, that's all I have for you today in this video. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Take care. Happy wheeling.